welcome everyone. Thank you all for joining us this Friday late afternoon. Wow, that's some dedication. Usually, like from in college, like Friday afternoon was like your Fridays in general. You're pretty much going somewhere that didn't involve learning anything. Um, but you guys are all here. I assume that it's for it's also for the love too. So appreciate that. So we got a really special guest today. This is Samantha Chipman, and she's joining us from, I believe, Georgia today. Um, I met Samantha through who has done multiple talks with us, so we very well. And she introduced us to Samantha, who's doing so much. She's doing a lot of very, very interesting work. I mean, it's hard for me to encapsulate it, but right now she's a disability advocate. She's a literary scholar. She's a bioethicist, and she also does a lot of things uh, in different communities and special communities too. For example, adoptees. Uh, but Samantha, I mean, I could probably, I don't want to misspeak all the things you do. So maybe I'll ask you to, if you'd like to tell us, the things that you're most proud of or you're most happy about in your work, and if you want to get started after that, that would be great.
Absolutely, that sounds lovely. And so I am a PhD student of English at Emory University and a bioethics certificate candidate. What I am most proud of, or what really brings me joy, that's such an interesting question. And it would essentially just be all of the time that you have in a graduate program to read what you love. And that's essentially what the experience of being a doctoral student boils down to, reading what you love and then being able to be an advocate and to be a part of and to build communities to help us care for one another. So without further ado, please let me know if the technology is working. If it isn't, just holler. The title for this talk is just a brief introduction to autism narratives and what I wish I knew before I was diagnosed. And so this is just going to be an opportunity to discuss autism narratives and to engage with an illustrative example. And so, with that being said, one of the things that I wish I knew when I was diagnosed was this idea that I wasn't alone. When you're going through the experience of autism diagnosis, sometimes it's difficult to capture exactly what it feels like in the moment because of all of the emotions and experiences that I can't quite seem to recreate in the present moment, but still resonate today. And it's not really great for communities such as Cultural Autism Studies at Yale or Cassie Sparks, bringing a safe place to have these kinds of conversations. And so I am an autist discussing autism, and I'm aware of my positionality in doing this work. And so when I entered graduate school, all I really wanted to know is what are the different meanings and narratives about autism. And in this sense, I was able to combine my absolute love of science fiction with archives. And this enabled me to see that all I wanted to do was spend my time reading old documents. And so, what is autism? Before a time the term was created, that is exactly what I do, those medical literary histories. And there's a certain kind of vulnerability when discussing autism as a personal experience and intersecting it with academic work. And that kind of tension, those kinds of risks are something that we can feel today. Just as a disclosure, I'm in no position, to control the content. And of course, there are no biomedical products at all involved with this discussion. I'm in literature. Just as a brief overview of what we are discussing today, it will be the difficulty and the complexities of pinpointing autism, a brief overview of autism narratives, and just some ideas that we can brainstorm together about how to integrate and acknowledge autism narratives in healthcare. So just as an overview, autism is a constellation. We can think about the different definitions and meanings of the term. And in your own thinking, you might drop your own kind of thoughts in the chat if you'd want to discuss later. Autism has been defined as a developmental disability caused by neurological differences in the brain. Common traits include difficulty communicating, maintaining friendships, engaging in social interactions, and sensory overload. Have a funny story to share. And so when I experience sensory overload, it usually has to do with frayed edges and textures on chairs, holes in blankets, and stuff like that. And unfortunately for me, if it gets to a point where I feel uncomfortable enough, I break out in hives. It's itchy and it's red and it's uncomfortable. And so I know when my senses are completely overloaded physically. Autism is also a kind of identity or a way that we can think about how we define the self that's differentiated along intersectional axes. And so sometimes I might consider a set of questions or problems in relation to autism. The other thing that I might think about too is other forms of identity, such as gender or race. And so I'm one of many women with a late diagnosis of autism, was diagnosed at age 12. And this is not even that late of a diagnosis in comparison to others, just thinking about the hesitation of this diagnosis timing. And it was due in part to the stigma of autism itself. That stigma in itself, which we can see on this constellation, framed the way that I was even able to attach myself to the term. So my parents were reluctant to obtain a diagnosis for that reason. Autism is also a form of neurodiversity, and that's the idea that neurological differences such as autism, ADHD, are a result of natural variations in the human genome. And I definitely took John Elder Robinson's perspective of neurodiversity. And we could also include in this type of axis this idea that autism can change. And so it's possible to feel alienated and unseen with a deficit only definition of the term. At the same time, we can recognize and acknowledge the importance of naming impairments and addressing them on the ground. Defining autism is a hazard because its personal experience fluctuates with a medical definition. And acknowledging this difficulty in any kind of clinical communication is part of my call to action. And so we might also think about autism as laden with hope, not only of autists who want to redefine the term or flip its script, but also of neuroscience and psychiatry itself. How can we think about these practices in medicine as reparative, as healing? And so one thing that I might turn to here is return to this notion of what it's like to camouflage and mask the diagnosis. That would be to mask so-called autistic traits such as not maintaining eye contact or having a slightly differentiated cadence in speech in education and context. And these kinds of contexts can co-opt masking behaviors. So we might not ask what kind of masking behaviors exist. We might also ask what types of environments enable masking to continue. And so when it comes to thinking about who is and is not privileged as a knower, it can be dehumanizing to not be thought of as a full self, especially in clinical interactions. And so I feel comfortable sharing with you today a time when I wanted testing accommodations in high school. And when I requested these accommodations, I was told that I was manipulating the education system in order to obtain extended time on math tests. And so instead of thinking about this kind of request as taking advantage of the system, reframing it as advocacy would have been helpful in that circumstance. At the same time, the onus to make a support system should not fall solely on individuals. And so what I would have wanted to hear in that time is I am really here to accompany you. Another thing to think about too is what is this boundary between the self that is diagnosed and the different forms of autism that we can encounter. And so it's easy to feel alienated from autism narratives if you don't see yourself in different media representations. At the same time, that makes me feel hopeful because all those points of diversity is a signpost for all of the variations in the term. And it also means that there's this text of autism that is created in real time. This is the narrative that really had me consider the diagnosis. And it's a bit difficult for me to quite capture what it was like to receive a diagnosis and to read this book in order to make sense of it. So all cats have Asperger's syndrome. Asperger's has now been phased out of DSM. That is its own conversation. But clinging on to narratives is a way that we can make sense of the diagnosis. And so I remember that they changed the conclusion since this last inception, because the idea here was that there might not be a little bit of Asperger's. It was meant to be a unifying statement that came across as flattening to some folks. At the same time, this book resonates because cats are one of my special interests. And so when I ran an autism community circle at Loyola University Chicago, my previous institution, what better signpost to have at the center of the circle than a cat plush, where it can refer to the text as a way to build solidarity and to acknowledge our differences. And these aspects can be difficult to translate or even transfer. And so there's a utility in the medical diagnosis and redefining autism. And this is a way for us to consider, how can we meet each other where we are? How can narratives harm and heal? Narratives are not neutral. Media representations and stereotypes matter. Narratives can have subversive elements. They can empower folks and they can make them feel more seen. They can also perpetuate stereotypes. And so the underrepresentation of certain groups in autism, media representations, and in research, scaffold or essentially are embedded in the way that we think about autism. And so that would be a reflection of what it takes, what it means to take up space. And so here we have this kind of wall of autism narratives. And I encourage you in the chat and later in our discussion to think about narratives, not just autism narratives, but any kind of narrative that really touched you, that really resonated with you. At least for me, reading John Elder Robinson's work in high school, when I was considering autism for my junior theme, was a way for me to really pinpoint the complexity of having a so-called invisible diagnosis. And so there's a passage in the book about what it is like to have a physical disability and then having something that is more difficult to be seen. And what it's the differences between disability and impairment. All of that is to acknowledge the fuzziness of autism and to consider ways to reclaim autist voices in healthcare and other settings. And so in that regard, we might return to a set of the questions. If anything is to be taken away from this talk, it wouldn't be just a series of answers. It would be all of the questions that fall out of this discussion. How should we read people? How do we read minds, bodies, and differences? What kinds of histories are embedded in the differences that we conceptualize now? And so in that regard, one practice that we can hang on to is narrative ethics, and this idea of the intersection between stories and moral values. Stories as mediums to explore ethical questions and to allow the particular to generate their aesthetic and ethical construction. Narratives, though, are contingent. They're always laden with contingencies. What information is included? Who is telling the story? Who is actually recorded in documentation? Other kinds of norms and boundaries. And so in that regard, we might also think about what are the limitations of narrative ethics, but also the utility of a practice such as narrative medicine, using the methods of close reading, reflective writing, and considering the implications of metaphors in the field of medicine. And so just a little bit about autism narratives in healthcare. I mentioned narrative medicine, and so we can double down on the side that it is possible to have a phenomenological process or a kind of process that accounts for your experience, your subjective experience as an individual in something like data, in something like the clinic. You might think about how cultural representations of autism matter. If, let's say, autism is diagnosed along the strains of Western norms, such as a Western kind of ideation of eye contact, you might consider alternate views of the diagnosis, such as different cultural representations. And if we are critiquing this idea of the so-called difference between the East and West, might reframe the question to ask, where is autism located? And that would also be a call to engage with autism counter narratives. And that would be this idea of understanding metaphors shape our understanding of the diagnosis. Autism, a kind of philosophical query with its own ethics. I've been speaking a little bit about my own experience, but what gives me the right to speak from below? I also am able to speak and feel comfortable speaking to a virtual audience such as yourself. That in itself is a positionality. So, who decides which autism narratives are heard? And that speaks to questions of power and authority. And so, if we think about narratives as a space for reflection and reflexivity, stories also enable imagination and innovation. And so, they can also be any number of things, which is to say, what is the utility or what is the trade off of not leaving a story at silence and oppression? And so, that would be to consider counter narratives or representing stories of historically oppressed, marginalized, and silenced, or a kind of counter as a resistance to domination and structures of oppression. And in this regard, I am reminded of what kinds of stories about disability are recorded, let's say, in the 18th century. What writings do we have about 19th century asylums that are also do not say anything about anyone else, if that's regard? So, which stories are heard? And another thing that we can take away from this is ensuring that language gives rise to action. And so the telling of narratives and sharing of stories and empathizing with others is its own sets of norms and practices within boundaries. We might also think about what it will be like to integrate autism narratives in a space such as healthcare. And that would be to what does it take to encounter autism narratives in clinical spaces? And these are just a few actionable items that we can take from today, such as including neurodiversity narratives and disability awareness training in medical education, such as a class or a module, multiple modes for communicating processes and procedures, extra time and downtime to process complex situations, and what might help a certain population, such as folks with disabilities, might also be measures that can help make healthcare more accessible for other types of groups too. And so this isn't a zero-sum game. Healthcare can be conceptualized as a shared and interrelated good rather than just an individual kind of good. And we might also think about universal design, accessibility, and inclusion in clinical spaces. As I'm making this list, or as I'm reading them, please feel free to list your own examples in the chat of what helps you, what changes you think need to be made that we can discuss later. One thing that I might flag too is that what's also going on in workplaces, such as Microsoft Neurodiversity Hiring Program of 2015, where I'd also think about the kinds of work environments that we're in as pivotal to our health and well-being. Some other measures could include policy frameworks and processes should be co-created with community members and to create an approach from the ground up rather than a top-down hierarchical model. Respect for community members and healthcare practitioners who enact these changes in accessibility measures, not only just considering these types of measures as an add-on, but crucial and fundamental to the processes and procedures in a clinical setting, and also compensating autists for their contributions to medicine as such. And one thing that we can also think about is to reevaluate outcome measures of clinical interventions, care plans, and research agendas. For example, if we are making a technology for folks with disabilities, is this technology being conceptualized with this notion of a fixing only, or is it also being conceptualized as a support system? This idea here is just to consider the different dimensions that go into something like that kind of thing, that kind of tech. In research and policy, building onto this idea of technology, we can include transparency about initiatives, data use, and their research process, and a community engaged initiatives that treat autists as knowers and co-creators of, let's say, technologies, apps, and other assisted devices that can be reframed as support systems. And we might also revise research policies and protocols to ensure autists lead our participants in are ethically treated in the design and implementation of neurodiversity related projects. This is all very, just to point out that a lot of the research from the NIH, at least from 2008 to 2018, was allocated to treatment, development, evaluation, and biomarkers and genetics. And so not only to understand the underlying causes for autism, but also the environment that makes it up. And also to place a greater emphasis on community-based initiatives and support systems, let's say in the stream of funding. We can also ask varied questions such as autist strengths, contextualizing genetic biomarkers with their history, as well as autism relationships. Increased investment in communication tools, support system as research, and increased investment in healthcare quality improvement, which goes to the other point about NIH funding, as well as using phenomenological or story-based methods to acknowledge and address autism lived experience in healthcare, education, and other settings. And that is a lot easier said than done. And so just as we move on to some key reflections here, we might consider how neurodiversity and autism narratives are made up in a web of power relations and complex social structures. How stories can empower, inhibit, spread stereotypes, and be a reparative creative outlet for our purposes, such as building a community. And so just as a final kind of thought, autism studies has provided me with language tools and resources to make sense of my own autism journey, while I also reflect on the limitations of language to describe subjective experience, as well as this idea that autism, even if it didn't technically exist in a time period, let's say before the 20th century, how threads of how we make up a neurological other still resonate. Autism is constantly evolving, and we can place power back in the hands of community members if we give them a voice. And it's also to acknowledge that narratives are not spun from nowhere, and that we should take seriously the role of relationality and community when you're in something like autism studies, or when we are recreating ways to make our systems better. Stories are not written without intentions, underlying hopes, desires, and biases. And so being able to discern these types of figments is part and parcel with the method that I'm proposing, which is engaging with autism narratives in healthcare. I wanted to share this list of resources that I have collected over the years, and also just embedded in a slideshow presentation. If the QR code is not working for you, that's completely understandable because it has failed me in the past. So if you want these slides or any other specific set of resources, please feel free to email and contact me. This talk is more of an invitation to further discussion than anything else. And finally, let's not leave with all of the solutions. Let's think about the questions. What's one thing that we can take away from this discussion? What other kinds of questions inspire, interest, and haunt you? What can we learn from each other? And so this is my email right here. And below the email is actually the landing page for the NeuroHumanism Intersecting Minds Collective that I co-founded with Melanie Gregg and Ryan Weber. And that is also another safe space where we engage and just essentially discuss questions in the neurohumanities. The website has a dynamic lexicon. We have an open call for art submissions for our theme, Sensing the Unseen. So it's definitely a party over there. There's stuff happening. And so with that being said, I will stop sharing my screen so that we can speak to each other in Zoom boxes. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Samantha. I think that's completely right down our alley here. I think this idea of collaboration, I mean, Don says this all the time, this community here is, it's hosted, has some resources from the university here, but it really is kind of its own thing in the sense that it's very horizontal in its structure. I did recently gave a presentation kind of speaking to this similar challenge and quoting Albert Einstein that the problems we currently face cannot be solved by the same kind of thinking we were using when we created them. So, the top-down approach I think has overstayed its invitation here. And this is very exciting that you're thinking about all this different kind of collaboration across lots of different areas. You know, and I think just healthcare in general, I think it is really needing this kind of approach. I mean, people like to talk about it, but um, it's slow to actually happen. Um, but yeah, if anyone has any questions, or anything that you want to say right now, you can either just raise your hand, or you can even just jump in if you want. Otherwise, I'm just going to look at the chat and see what questions we have there.
Absolutely. A lot of rich discussion and commentary in the chat. Thank you so much for your engagement.
Great. Go ahead.
I have worked in physical healthcare and in mental health care, and this reminds me of a very specific incident when we were being taken over by a different healthcare system. So they were like implementing stuff between different departments. And I worked for surgeons, which is a very generally specific type of personality and type of training. And one of the things that they did was they had people swap jobs so that like my trauma surgeon was in charge of like somebody who was working the front desk to understand what they have to deal with, and like swapping back and forth. And then we all came back together after however long it was and said like, what did you learn could help, whatever. And they were all such simple things that just had gotten lost in practice. So I remember the surgeon I was there with said like, shook everyone's hands. And I thought, well, like that seems like an odd thing to forget to do, but it seems like it really had an impact on him, just like taking that moment. So it just made me think, like, I wonder what would happen. I have no idea how it would work if healthcare professionals were in situations learning about different neurodiversities, however quick and simple it may be. Because I think I put in the chat, I had a neurologist, I was there for migraines. He must have caught something and turned his computer around so that I could see him typing in the instructions. And it was so helpful to me. It made me feel like I was absorbing the information differently because it was complicated. There were like MRIs and different, do this on that, do this, that, and the other. And I walked away thinking, why isn't that just like standard practice? Like that was so helpful. It made me think like, I wonder if that doctor had some, I walked away thinking, I wonder if that doctor has someone in their family or something that they caught something I was doing that they did that, rather than like, did they have training? So, again, I don't know how to implement any of that, but those are just reminding me of those two situations. Honestly, before this conversation, I had never really thought of.
Hmm. It's incredibly fascinating to think about. So thank you so much for sharing. What you said about swapping roles kind of made me consider or encourage me to consider this idea that of the double empathy problem, right? This idea that autists have a difficult time understanding quote unquote neurotypical folks. Neurotypical folks have a difficulty understanding autists. At the same time, we can kind of double back on this binary and really critique this so-called framework if we think about this idea that it's actually difficult inherently to understand each other. And if we take that idea for granted, it could close off opportunities to think of different questions and or measures that can make us feel more welcome or more comfortable. Might really go back into the weeds of this and explicitly lay out the social and medical model of disability, which is something that your question alludes to. The social model of disability is a claim that disability is constructed by the environment that you're in. And so you're not disabled by this idea that you're in a wheelchair, you are disabled by the lack of a ramp to a building. Model is that kind of idea or that kind of biomedical deficit only model that I critiqued in the talk. The neurodiversity model that I spoke of is actually something that blends together elements of the biomedical model along with the social model, which is to say that we can acknowledge the power inherent, let's say, in a diagnosis while also seeing the limitations there. When it comes to actually implementing spaces for folks, the first thing that I thought of is actually a kind of a lo-fi sound environment for neurodiverse and autistic folks. And how having a quiet space in educational and workplace settings might not only be beneficial to that population, but also to other folks too. I read there's a lot of utility in thinking about that sort of thing. What would it be like, let's say, to have like a silenced headphone set at the workspace just for folks to use? Just kind of thinking outside the box about those sorts of things. Another thing to think about is reframing participation. And so, if we all blast back to the past, when we were in school, you might have had a participation grade. Sometimes this grade is based off of how much you speak in class. And so, reframing participation to be something like writing to your professor or acknowledging other forms of engagement. For example, if you like to doodle while you take notes, not prohibiting the doodling as part of something that you can do. And that could also transfer to the workplace space too. What kind of presenteeism is an expectation? What kind of perceptions and limitations does that create?
Yeah, with love and respect for your efforts. Who had to have a high level of intelligence and almost PhD level of understanding about my complicated medical conditions, and then advocate within a emotionally abusive family system where I was also financially abused, and who speaks articulately about it in manners I can only imagine people who are my neighbors and who share the same resource levels as I could never access. This all seems so mind-numbingly unrealistic. The most advanced healthcare system around me now is shadow banning, no longer taking EDS patients, because since being taken over by private equity, the quality of their care has gone in the toilet. And I can imagine that's happening all over, even teaching hospitals in America. And in the face of this unbelievable elephant in the room, we're sitting here pontificating what headphones might be best for those in doctoral programs when the rest of the country is burning and our best resources have been sold. I hate to show up with that energy because it's been so beautiful here and your heart seems so gentle and in the right place. But I want you to know, because you all seem so gentle and in the right place, what Shark Tank that you're swimming in working for. And you talk about biomedical ethics. I'm telling you, the quality of care for the people you're advocating for has sharply declined in the last, let's say, decade, right? And I think touched on it. At first, I was flared up by the suggestion because this is a scapegoat, right? This is a straw man argument. Oh, it's COVID. All you introverts took away our community spaces. We need to get back to the office. That is what's ruining it. No, it's not. It's the fact we're all out here working 4 jobs now, and that's changed significantly in my lifetime in the last 30 years. Let's not pretend it's not the overtaking of private equity and the loss of our free time and say, oh, it's these introverts who want to work from home, it's their fault. Because that's the argument we've heard as well. And I just want to let you know, as somebody who's out here consuming this care, how incredibly difficult it is to get, and how the patients out here are noticing over widely. I can't even say the United States because it's happening in the UK as well. These complicated conditions are getting harder and harder to access care for. The barriers are not an accident. And I think they give you performative couple bucks while they set up barriers they know are barriers. And I want to make sure that your research isn't used to manipulate the populations you're trying to serve and improve the lives of. My bitter rant is done. and you know, and you are doing good work, but I want you to be grounded with 2 feet in reality and 2 wide open eyes.
Thank you so, so much for a rich and insightful perspective. That's the kind of thing that I have nightmares about at night, which is this gap between
And the real world.
it's real and it exists. That distance is always present. And as you stated, with the quality of care and excessive access to it to begin with, even what are the constraints and contempts of time and healthcare? Because those kinds of constraints and contempts are also evolving. Thank you so much.
I would also add that is such a huge problem. I mean, I would actually welcome a series of discussions and presentations on that matter that you just discussed. I mean, there's so many issues there, with yet inequities and what's being focused on in academia, and then there's this big business side to it, this sort of this machine, that's eh, I don't want to get into it here, but I do acknowledge for sure these serious issues, and I do appreciate someone being upfront and just laying it out, because I mean, this is a space, and I should probably clarify that here, we are very much about discussing ideas, so contrary ideas or ideas that may be difficult or not the most cozy things to discuss, they're more than welcome here, because at the end of the day, we are trying to we're about truth. We want to figure out what's happening, and we want to try to, at least within our sort of control or efforts, have some kind of an impact. And I know sometimes it sounds like there's a huge gap, but I would have to say most of us here are always thinking about, like, how the heck does this stuff impact quality of life to individuals? Because if it doesn't, then what's the point of doing it? And I know Samantha is very much in line with that. But the mission here in general is about quality of life, and a lot of things that might sound very abstract or disconnected, it may be at that time, but I don't want people to interpret that as that, we're not thinking about how this impacts everyday life for the people who are sort of suffering in silence. I think that is a lot on my mind. But I do appreciate people bringing this up. So thank you.
Thank you.
Who's next? Who had their hand up here? Heard from you.
I just wanted to add, I'm a peer specialist, which I think different states call it different things. So basically, I don't have a clinical education. My education is based on my own experience, and then I receive specialized training to support people going through their own journeys, which is wonderful and it's a growing field, but like we're calling this every day is clinical versus individualized. The medical model is what we're kind of battling. But I've just realized through this conversation that we normally by default we help out anybody with a mental health diagnosis because empathy is empathy and we'll figure out the details later. But I've worked in 2 different states, and both times we're required to be crossovers for what is the term that I hate, IDD, and wherever things may fall into that. So I think there is a tiny bit of hope in that particular field exists, I think it definitely needs to be grown because, like, I only found out that I was autistic, and I've been in the field for a long time. And up until then, I still thought that autism meant a certain level of needs. And I didn't understand it. So, like, even me being in the field didn't get the education about that end of things. So, like, I think I shared in the chat that we received these amazing trainings about, like, hearing voices where we have to put headphones on, so, like, we understand how distracting it is, if somebody is experiencing that, and how that can impact, like, how they engage, like, to then tailor, like, okay, well, maybe it's not because their CPAP isn't working that they're not sleeping. Turns out this experience of somebody screaming at them is keeping them awake, to sort of like filter needs. And it's so helpful. But nothing like that really exists as far as autism. So, like, one, it's no one thing that would have one training, and I recognize that that would be tricky. But I think it's accidentally gotten lost overall, even in the field that is supposed to be like the Me Too helpers of it, and that might be an entry point into people that are already on board for supporting and already acutely aware of the difference between clinical models and behavioral models and neurodivergent models in other ways. I just wanted to share it as a possible point of entry for change, training, support.
Absolutely. Any entry point is fair game.
Can I just tag on to that because I feel that's so hard? And I've been diagnosed. So I have a wonderful care team that's been in place for forever. And even those people, when I start, first of all, they never noticed, but like, let's just move on from that. But my psychiatrist, when I started realizing they're good people, said there's no point in getting diagnosed as an adult. There's no point putting yourself through that. So I think I missed education there. But also, he's right. He's like, going through like and getting all that. And then my therapist, whom I adore and is so helpful to me, when this came up, said, I'm going to have to talk to some colleagues. I don't feel comfortable helping adults with autism. And those were both such shocking things that I had these great professionals that even they were kind of like, we don't really know what to do about that. So I lost an education even in myself based on education that they were always lacking. I have hope that as the DSM continues to turn, we're obviously in transition, that maybe that will mean as that changes that a broader network of people get information or better ideas of how to support. But yeah, I just wanted to throw that in because I just felt that so hard. Like, I have all the resources. I have all the resources. I have great insurance. I work in the field. I have these people, and I'm still encountering these problems.
If I can pop in, I say all of the time to my parents and my support people that, like, if money were the problem and me accessing care, it would have been solved already. Like, the problem is not money, the problem is that the resources don't exist in my community. And the community doesn't exist in my community because nobody's getting diagnosed in my community because the resources don't exist in my community. And without that name or that validation, it's hard for people to show up. And so it's all circular, right, with what I'm saying about, not being able to access basic healthcare. And then not finding community and not finding resources for adults. And providers' inability to even imagine that autistic people could look the way that a Zoom call looks. Stories are where I get solace, given that.
Has anyone else been actively discouraged from getting a formal diagnosis as an adult? Maybe that's like an entry problem too. Maybe like clinicians and researchers just don't have the correct data.
So quickly to that end, I have a friend who does run, or who doesn't run. He is a teacher at this program that does offer licensed continuing education hours, and is neuroaffirming. I did a very bad ADHD job of introing it, but I did just drop the link in the chat. So that's only one program I know about, and you all can, you have CE hours to fill. You can spend time in a space like this, as an alternative to harmful spaces with like-minded individuals, and keep building that web. So I'm not licensed, but I thought I'd drop that resource for you all.
Thank you. And then I think, is it?
Sure. To build upon this question of are people being rejected for or dissuaded from getting a diagnosis? So, for example, I think my dad is autistic, and I've been recently diagnosed, and basically several primary care clinicians and even trained psychologists, albeit not in autism, they all said there's no way you could be autistic, you did well in school. And so there's a lot of misconceptions and stereotypes that even, misinform your first gatekeepers for getting diagnosed. And as a result, it also took me over 2 years of actively looking. There was only one trained psychologist in my insurance in the state, and I had to travel 3 hours 3 times to then get diagnosed. So it is not accessible, is the logistical challenge. But even before that, the the lack of awareness and education, whether it's in your local communities like your school teachers. For some countries, school teachers are now being a gatekeeper to first say, hey, I see some potential symptoms, and then to get diagnosed. But most of the school systems that I encountered growing up obviously had no clue about autism, let alone have the resources that some of the previous speakers spoke about. And so there's a lack of resources to then educate the gatekeepers, whether it's your school teachers, your guidance counselors, your primary care physicians, and even the specialists, to help diagnose people properly. Because in part, there's more and more diagnoses for women and also adults. And often those are even harder to diagnose, in part because the studies have been based mostly, it seems, on boys and men, and then plus the adults have learned to mask, or if they're women, they perhaps manifest the traits or symptoms differently from what the Diagnostic Statistical Manual states. And now it's also a spectrum. So it's even more qualitative and subjective than without a standardized test.
That's absolutely fascinating. What you said resonates so much. This idea that if you are working, if you look like that, you're a function, if you are so-called successful, you're more easily missed. Or if you're just simply, a quiet, and in my case, Asian American girl. And so that definitely resonates in that regard too. And this idea about a lack of education of those key gatekeepers, of folks who do all the documentation. It's this matter of how does the documentation get in the way of the core issue, which is access to support systems. And so all those processes and procedures which are meant to make something just end up being inhibiting. It's very sad.
I guess to get sorry, I'm getting distracted by all the things. Thinking back to autism narratives and access to kind of communities, and places where you can kind of just be authentically more yourself. I was so surprised to find that sense of more of that on LinkedIn, which was so weird. I mean, I think that's how I even found this. Maybe this group was through LinkedIn. And I'm not like a social media person. I don't really use LinkedIn as a job anything, but like that was just like a really um, interesting place to find some of that dialogue happening. And then also thinking back to like the list of books you had, there are just like not that many books to access, about the autistic experience. From an autistic perspective, and I found so much on like Substack of just people blogging. Like blogs have just been such a resource for me in my like coming to know my own autistic identity. So it's just like the fact those kind of looking in some of those more like niche spaces, I think is just where it's at least right now.
Very true. Mm. This is also just a plug for blog, Musings of an SB. When I read like her blog about I am not Temple Grandin, that really resonated with me. And so being able to identify bits and pieces of these social media blogs and posts has been helpful. It's really powerful because we can think about social media as something inherently harmful to the way that we connect with one another, but at the same time, it's another platform, another space, another medium to try and make sense, meaning connect with one another. Yes.
Hi, I hope I'm audible.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. I'm really interested in autistic life writing and autobiography. And I'd mentioned this in the chat, and I just wanted to make this comment where I wanted to connect everything that you said with Autistic Disturbances, the book by Julia Rodas, where she talks about autistic poetics. And I just wanted to also ask you, don't you think it would be very beneficial if these patterns of autistic expressions were better understood and would help in conveying the messages in autism narratives as well, and if they were somehow more accessible to people? Do you think that's just something that popped into my head when I was listening to you?
Hmm. Very interesting. That's a wonderful comment. If there was more accessibility to autism narratives and let's say, quote unquote, autistic disturbances, would that be beneficial? Yes, I want to say that accessibility is inherently something good. At the same time, it's difficult to pinpoint this notion of accessing more autism narratives onto, let's say, on the ground issues and practices. And so this would also kind of reach into another area that I'm passionate about. That would be what does it take to create an archive? What is in building a body of literature? Because that in itself is an action and practice that has lots of power structures within it. As we also think back to about autism narratives, we can think about books that have the term autism, autistic, that kind of lexicon that we're describing. And then as we go farther back in history, what is it for those terms to drop off? And so reading, let's say, neurodivergence in 19th century poetry is different than reading, let's say, poetry by someone who is autistic today. And those are the types of questions that animate my work. So thank you for sharing. You still have your hand up.
I should also add on that is one of the reasons why we're doing this and recording this and we're putting these things online is because of access. It's freely available. Anyone can do it. They just need an internet connection. But the realization that not everybody wants to read like an entire book, or not everybody wants to wade through journal articles or sort of decode the language. When you're using YouTube, you can turn the video off, or you can leave it on. You can listen to it in the car. It's whenever you want. In as little chunks as you want. It's totally sort of on your terms, and that's really central to what we're trying to do here in terms of getting the narratives out there. Is making sure that the accessibility is just not an issue, because the only way to sort of overwrite stereotypes is getting information out there that in a way that the most number of people can access. So we have so many folks coming on, and that is the whole purpose of this, is to get as many voices out there as possible, because without that, the old stuff is just going to keep on going. There's a lot of people who have a lot of interest in that. So, this is about trying to help people who are really struggling, who really have not benefited at all, from the old systems. So thank you.
Amazing. Thank you for your comment. What you said also kind of reminds me of what kind of work conditions make accessibility possible. And so, just kind of as I self reflect for a moment, in some places, in some universities, you're not necessarily rewarded if you don't write, let's say, a classical research article that's behind a massive paywall and that is written in a kind of language that isn't easily read by everybody. And that's the kind of the environment of academia. And so part of that would also be to really circumvent that kind of work environment in order to at least, let's say, maybe write something else like a blog post, or to engage in more authentic discourse that isn't alienated from people's lived realities.
Great, everyone. So I really super appreciate this deep, authentic discussion. Again, this is what we're about. And I don't know what different environments are, but here we really want to be authentic. We do want to be, I mean, directness is appreciated. I think that there's a common understanding here that, we are aligned in a way that probably is different from a lot of other settings. And this is always a safe space, and Don's reiterated that multiple times. So, we want people to come, we want people to share, we want people to feel comfortable and just really be their authentic selves, and feel free to talk about all these truths. So thank you again. Samantha, did you have any parting remarks?
All I wanted to do was thank everybody for their listening today. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So when we process this video, I mean, we have an anonymization process to protect people's privacy, but we'll also put the links that people have shared in the chat and the email when the video is released, so that people will have access to those resources. All right, everyone, have a great weekend, and thank you again for spending time with us.
Thank you.